In the summer of 1943, inside a crowded munitions plant in Dayton, Ohio, Katherine Hale stood on a wooden loading crate while hundreds of workers watched in uneasy silence, her grease-stained uniform still marked with chalk. From the inspection line she had refused to falsify only hours earlier. The factory supervisor, Mr. Dillard, announced to the floor that insubordination during wartime would not be tolerated, and declared that since she would not follow production orders, she would be reassigned to whatever contractor offered the highest labor bid, turning what should have been a private disciplinary matter into a humiliating public spectacle meant to frighten every woman on that assembly line into obedience. And when Katherine refused to bow her head or apologize, Dillard began calling out mock bids to local subcontractors who supplied packing crews and scrap collectors, reducing her to a bargaining chip in front of men who avoided her eyes, while the American flag hung above the factory doors as if it were witnessing something it did not approve of. The laughter that followed the stage bidding faltered when a uniformed Army logistics sergeant stepped forward from the back of the crowd, his name patch reading Daniel Mercer, boots still dusted from the rail yard where he had been overseeing outbound artillery shipments, and in a calm but carrying voice, he asked the supervisor to clarify whether defective shell counts had anything to do with the reassignment. But a question that shifted the mood from mockery to unease, because everyone knew rumors had been spreading about cracked casings and rushed inspections. Dillard dismissed him, insisting this was an internal labor matter, but Mercer did not retreat, instead stating that any worker disciplined for refusing to falsify munitions data became a concern of the United States Army. And when he placed himself between Katherine and the supervisor, not touching her, yet unmistakably shielding her from further humiliation, the entire factory floor fell silent, the staged auction collapsing under the weight of a single, steady refusal to let it continue. Outside the factory gates, with the late afternoon whistle still echoing across the rail yard, Katherine pulled her arm free from Sergeant Mercer's protective stance and demanded to know why he had interfered in something that could now cost them both their positions. Her voice steady despite the humiliation she had endured only minutes earlier. Mercer answered that he had been auditing outgoing artillery shipments for weeks and had quietly noticed discrepancies in inspection stamps. And when he mentioned that a former Union safety organizer named Thomas Callahan had once warned the Army about rushed wartime production before disappearing from the plant records in 1942, Katherine froze because Callahan had been the one who trained her during her first weeks on the line and had taught her that patriotism meant protecting soldiers from defective equipment, not protecting supervisors from embarrassment. And for the first time since the spectacle in the warehouse, she saw that Mercer's intervention had not been theatrical heroism, but calculated concern tied to the same missing man whose name had never been spoken aloud, again inside those brick walls. They moved away from the factory entrance as workers trickled past, pretending not to listen, and Katherine admitted that Callahan had confided to her shortly before his dismissal that certain supervisors were diverting high-quality steel casings to private buyers while shipping lower-grade material overseas, a practice that could cause shells to misfire under battlefield pressure. And Mercer revealed that 2 recent reports from North Africa had described unexplained artillery failures traced back to shipments routed through Dayton. The realization that their suspicions overlapped shifted their conversation from confrontation to strategy, because neither of them was interested in revenge for humiliation, but both understood that silence would send dangerous ammunition into American hands. And when Mercer asked if she was willing to risk more than public shame to uncover proof, Katherine answered without hesitation that she had already been sold once that day in front of her own flag, and would not allow another soldier to pay the price for it, sealing a fragile but determined alliance built not on rescue, but on shared responsibility. They did not linger long outside the factory gates, because Dayton in wartime had ears in every diner booth and eyes behind every boarding house curtain, and Katherine knew that once a worker was publicly humiliated, she was expected either to disappear quietly into reassignment or return to the line chastened and obedient. Instead, she led Sergeant Mercer across the rail yard toward a narrow service entrance used by maintenance crews, explaining that she still had clearance to access certain inspection corridors until the supervisor processed formal termination papers, and as they walked, she outlined what she had observed over the past 6 months. Inspection quotas doubled without additional quality checks, crates relabeled after midnight, and certain supervisors locking away premium shell casings in a segregated storeroom that never appeared on standard shipping manifests, details that transformed her from a wronged employee into a precise internal witness whose memory could map the plant better than any blueprint, while Mercer listened not as a rescuer guiding her, but as a logistics officer recalculating routes and authority lines in real time. Inside a shadowed corridor overlooking the assembly floor, Katherine stopped beside a glass partition where rows of women in coveralls fed polished casings into hydraulic presses, and she said quietly that she did not want simply to clear her name, but to stop whatever arrangement was funneling flawed ammunition toward American artillery units overseas, proposing that instead of filing a complaint that could be buried in paperwork, they gathered documented proof, duplicate inspection stamps, altered shipment ledgers, and photographs of the segregated steel inventory, evidence strong enough to force Army auditors to act. Mercer hesitated only long enough to acknowledge that if they were discovered accessing restricted records, he could face court-martial for interfering in civilian production oversight. Yet he agreed that allowing defective shells to ship under the American flag was a greater violation than any procedural breach, and together they sketched a risky but deliberate plan. Katherine would retrieve access to the internal ledger room before her termination took effect, while Mercer would delay the next outbound convoy under the pretext of recalibrating load weights, buying them a narrow window to expose the truth before another shipment left Dayton's rail lines. That evening, as the second shift bell rang and supervisors focused their attention on meeting production quotas, Katherine moved through the administrative wing with a clipboard in hand, her posture calm and professional, despite knowing that any misstep could confirm the accusations already forming against her, while Sergeant Mercer positioned himself near the loading docks under the authority of a temporary shipment review he had requested earlier in the day, a request that would stall outbound artillery crates for at least 45 minutes. Inside the records office, rows of locked filing cabinets lined the walls beneath framed posters urging workers to speed the victory, and Katherine used her still active badge to access the ledger room where duplicate inspection stamps were stored in a metal drawer reserved for senior supervisors, discovering that several crates, marked with her forged approval, had in fact bypassed standard stress testing, their serial numbers rewritten in a different ink shade that suggested deliberate substitution rather than clerical error, and she quickly copied the altered shipment numbers into her notebook while listening for footsteps in the corridor, aware that the plant's loyalty to production numbers often outweighed loyalty to truth. Meanwhile, on the loading platform outside, Mercer inspected the artillery crates scheduled for departure and quietly redirected two of his trusted enlisted drivers to reweigh pallets under the guise of compliance verification, a delay that irritated the factory foreman, but prevented the convoy from rolling out before Katherine could return. And when she emerged carrying a small envelope of carbon copy shipping forms taken from the waste bin, she explained that high-grade steel casings had been rerouted to a private scrapbroker listed under a shell corporation connected to Supervisor Dillard's brother-in-law, evidence that suggested black market profiteering disguised as wartime efficiency. The realization that defective shells might not be accidental, but the byproduct of siphoned materials raised the stakes from internal misconduct to federal fraud, and as they compared serial numbers against the crates stacked on the dock, both understood that what began as a public humiliation in the factory had now evolved into documented proof of corruption, capable of endangering American artillery units across the Atlantic, making their next move not just an act of defiance, but a calculated strike against a system that had hidden behind patriotic slogans while gambling with these soldiers' lives, shifted them from quiet investigators to active disruptors, insisting that simply reporting the altered ledgers would allow Dillard time to destroy evidence, and instead proposing they intercept one shipment publicly enough to force external scrutiny. Mercer agreed, though he warned that halting a wartime artillery transport without formal authorization could trigger immediate disciplinary action. Yet the risk of allowing defective shells to reach American artillery crews outweighed procedural caution, and together they selected 3 crates whose serial numbers matched Katherine's copied ledger entries, and opening them under the authority of Mercer's temporary weight audit, while dock workers watched with growing unease as steel casings were lifted from straw packing and placed under inspection lamps. Under bright industrial light, Katherine ran her hands along the metal seams and pointed out subtle stress fractures near the base of the shell casings, cracks that would expand under firing pressure, while Mercer compared them against intact casings from an earlier verified batch, and the difference was unmistakable even to the foreman, who had earlier dismissed their concerns. Word spread across the loading floor that flawed shells had nearly been shipped overseas, and whispers quickly turned into anger among workers who had sons and brothers in uniform, because the idea that negligence or profiteering might endanger American troops struck deeper than any factory dispute. And before Dillard could intervene, Mercer radioed his logistics command, requesting immediate temporary hold status on the Dayton shipment pending quality review, effectively freezing outbound transport and drawing formal attention from regional Army auditors. Dillard arrived moments later, red-faced and furious, accusing Katherine of sabotage and Mercer of overstepping his authority. But the open crates and visible fractures had already shifted the mood of the dock workers, who no longer saw a disgraced employee but a woman who had prevented potentially fatal equipment from reaching the front lines, and as military police were notified to document the halted convoy, Katherine understood that their calculated exposure had crippled not just one shipment, but the supervisor's quiet scheme to divert high-grade materials for private resale, transforming her from the subject of a public auction into the catalyst of a public reckoning that would now force the factory, and perhaps the town, to confront what had been hidden beneath patriotic production banners. The momentum they gained at the loading dock did not translate into immediate victory, because within hours, Supervisor Dillard shifted from defensive outrage to strategic retaliation, quietly contacting plant security and alleging that Katherine had deliberately tampered with the shipment to create the very fracture she claimed to expose, framing her as a disgruntled worker, seeking revenge after public humiliation. By dawn the next morning, military police arrived at her boarding house with formal notice that she was under investigation for industrial sabotage during wartime production, a charge severe enough to carry federal prison time. And although Sergeant Mercer protested the timing and questioned the sudden reversal of blame, and he was informed that as a logistics officer he had exceeded his jurisdiction by interfering in civilian factory operations, placing his own record under review and effectively isolating Katherine from the one ally who had stood beside her on the dock. At the temporary holding office inside the factory administration wing, Katherine sat across from 2 stern-faced investigators who repeated Dillard's claim that she had accessed restricted areas without authorization and altered inspection logs, yet instead of shrinking under accusation, she calmly described the sequence of events, citing specific serial numbers, timestamps, and witness names from the dock crew who had observed the open crates, forcing the investigators to take notes rather than dismiss her as emotional. Outside the office, Mercer faced a separate reprimand hearing, where he was warned that continuing to advocate for her could result in court-martial for insubordination, and in that moment the true weight of retaliation became clear. Not only was the corruption network attempting to silence Katherine, it was attempting to fracture the partnership that had exposed it, betting that fear of military discipline would push Mercer to distance himself, but instead he refused to withdraw his earlier report, formally submitting his inspection findings to regional command and tying his career to the same truth she was defending, escalating the conflict from factory politics to a confrontation that now carried federal consequences for all involved. 3 days later, under pressure from both plant management and regional military command, a public wartime disciplinary hearing was convened inside the factory assembly hall, the same space where victory banners hung above rows of machinery and where Katherine had been forced onto a crate during her staged auction and now folding chairs filled the floor as workers, foremen, and uniformed personnel gathered to witness what was expected to be her formal disgrace. Dillard stood near the front with carefully arranged ledgers and typed statements, accusing her of unauthorized record access and intentional disruption of federal production, while Katherine, released temporarily from holding, was escorted in without handcuffs but under clear suspicion, and Sergeant Mercer took a seat among other enlisted men. They had officially ordered not to interfere, yet visibly present as a reminder that the halted shipment had not been imaginary. When the presiding Army auditor invited statements, Dillard spoke first, framing the incident as emotional instability born of humiliation and claiming that morale during wartime required strict discipline, subtly suggesting that women on the line were prone to impulsive reactions under pressure. But when Katherine was given her chance to respond, she did not defend herself emotionally. Instead, she requested that 3 dock workers be asked to describe what they had seen inside the open crates, and that the altered serial numbers be compared publicly against the official shipment ledger, and as documents were passed across the table and murmurs spread through the hall, she addressed the crowd directly, stating that refusing to falsify inspection data was not rebellion, but loyalty to the men firing those shells overseas, and that no supervisor had the authority to gamble with American lives for private profit. The turning point came when Mercer stood, despite earlier warnings, and confirmed under oath that he had independently verified the fractures before any accusation of sabotage arose, anchoring her testimony to military procedure rather than personal emotion. And as factory workers, many with family members serving abroad, began to question why a supervisor would rush shipments while diverting high-grade steel to an unlisted broker, the narrative shifted from insubordination to potential corruption, transforming the hearing from a spectacle designed to shame Katherine into a public examination of Dillard's authority, and setting the stage for consequences far larger than a single employee's fate. The assembly hall did not erupt immediately, because wartime discipline had trained the town to hesitate before challenging authority. Yet the silence that followed Sergeant Mercer's sworn statement carried a different weight than the earlier mockery in the warehouse, and when the Army auditor requested the financial records connected to the unlisted steel broker, a second envelope was presented by a regional investigator who had quietly traced payments routed through a shell corporation registered to Dillard's extended family, exposing a pattern of diverted premium casings sold at inflated scrap prices, while inferior materials were fed into artillery production. As the evidence was read aloud beneath the factory's hanging American flag, workers who had once avoided Katherine's eyes now shifted uncomfortably toward the supervisor, there realizing that the humiliation staged in the name of discipline had been designed to silence the one person who refused to falsify inspection reports, and the hearing, originally convened to punish a supposed saboteur, began to resemble a tribunal for the man who had orchestrated her public degradation. Dillard attempted one final defense, arguing that production quotas demanded difficult compromises and that minor material substitutions were common during wartime strain. But when metallurgical samples taken from the intercepted crates were presented, clearly showing structural weakness under stress testing, the justification collapsed under technical proof, and the Army auditor formally announced suspension of the supervisor pending federal investigation for fraud and endangerment of military equipment. In that moment, the same crowd that had watched Katherine stand on a crate in forced silence now witnessed her name cleared under official authority. And as military police escorted Dillard from the hall, murmurs turned into steady applause, not for rebellion, but for accountability, because the town understood that protecting soldiers overseas required courage at home as well. Mercer did not step forward to claim credit, and Katherine did not deliver a triumphant speech. Instead, she stood upright beneath the flag where she had once been shamed, her dignity restored not by rescue alone, but by her refusal to bend when truth was inconvenient. And as the hearing adjourned and workers returned to their stations with renewed seriousness, the factory floor felt altered, no longer a stage for intimidation, but a reminder that even in wartime, patriotism demanded integrity rather than obedience. 2 years later, when the war finally ended, and factory whistles no longer signaled emergency production shifts, The Dayton munitions plant stood quieter. Its once relentless pace softened into peacetime industry, and a bronze plaque was mounted near the loading dock where the halted convoy had first exposed the flawed shells, dedicating the site to integrity and service, a phrase chosen not by executives, but by the workers who remembered how close defective artillery had come to reaching American troops. Katherine Hale returned that autumn not as an employee under scrutiny, but as a safety-compliant supervisor invited to speak at a veterans gathering. Her wartime record formally cleared, and her testimony cited in federal reforms that tightened inspection standards across multiple plants. And when she stepped into the same assembly hall that had hosted her public humiliation, she carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had endured both accusation and vindication without surrendering her principles. Sergeant Daniel Mercer, now discharged and dressed in civilian clothes, stood near the back of the hall rather than beside her on stage, their partnership no longer defined by confrontation, but by mutual respect earned under pressure. And when Katherine addressed the crowd, she did not recount the spectacle of the auction or the fear of arrest. Instead, she spoke about responsibility during crisis, reminding the audience that patriotism was not measured only by uniforms or quotas, but by the willingness to refuse shortcuts that endangered others. And after the ceremony, they walked together past the rail yard where artillery crates once waited for shipment, reflecting on how a single refusal to falsify numbers had altered both their lives, transforming an attempted public sale into a turning point that strengthened the town's conscience. In the years that followed, they remained in Dayton, contributing to community projects, supporting returning veterans, and advocating for workplace safety reforms. And though history would record grand battles fought overseas, those who lived through 1943 remembered that courage had also been required on American soil, where dignity defended under a factory flag proved just as vital to victory as any weapon forged within its walls.